let's ask the question, what is the challenge of this market? What should we focus on in terms of understanding this market? Lack of information, right? It's essentially a market in which there is a persistent informational uncertainty. There are informational asymmetries, that is to say that parties to transactions in this market have unequal levels of information. But beyond that, there's simply informational uncertainty across the market, which means that it shouldn't function, because a market that doesn't have information is a market that is inefficient to the point of non-functioning or failure, right? And yet the market did function, and it functioned spectacularly well, despite not having what we would think of as this enabling condition, enough information to entice capital to enter the market to get it functioning. So the question that we have today is to try to resolve that conundrum. How did the Romans manage to generate an optimally efficient or near optimally efficient market, absent what we would identify as a core enabling condition, without which we would predict the market couldn't function? So what I'd like to do to start us today in terms of reviewing this is to engage in what the Germans call a Gedankenexperiment, a thought experiment. This was the tool that Einstein used to come up with the theory of special relativity. We're going to use it to come up with the theory of the Roman grain trade. If it worked for Einstein, it's good enough for us. A Gedankenexperiment, a thought experiment, to ask if we take this market, the market conditions that we've encountered in the text, in the abstract. So that is to say, strip it outside of its Roman particulars in terms of what the Romans actually did, and consider how we would solve for the problem of information in the market. What kind of answer would we derive? What kind of market would we produce in order to get this market to function? And we can start with the premise: if the problem of the market is a persistent lack of information, what does that suggest the market needs? What? Information, right? If we can give the market information, we can get that market to function, because a market that has information is a market then that can function. Where does the information start in this market? What's the beginning point of information in this market? The merchants. Really?
The farmers.
The farmers, okay. Do we agree, the farmer? We all agreed? I might even go one further and say actually it's the seed of grain that the farmer plants in the ground. Actually, that's what carries the information, right? Because that seed carries with it a certain amount of price information, so you know how much it costs to put in the ground and the labor and so on. So if we start with, does it start with the population in Rome that wants bread? No, why not? Yes, it does.
Based on that, then you know how much bread you need to produce, of course.
Okay, so if you don't have the hungry Romans, you don't know how much bread to produce. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, but it's always a need that triggers the production.
That's right. It's need that triggers production. Where is the need in our hypothetical market? Where does the need start? Hungry people in Rome? Hungry farmer, right? And maybe his wife and 2 kids. Starts there. So actually the problem with, if we were to think, okay, well, the information starts with a hungry population in Rome, that actually presupposes the functioning of the market. Problem is we're not there yet. We don't have a market that functions because we've predicted that a market that doesn't have information cannot actually bring grain to Rome. So it starts then with the grain that goes in the ground and the need that attaches to that, which is the need of the farmer, him or herself. And so if the farmer grows the grain and produces enough for himself or herself and adds a little extra supply, at that point now we have surplus agriculture and it starts to move into the market. Now we have a market, right? That is to say the farmer can now sell a little bit of that surplus on. So let's imagine if you're our farmer and you have a donkey and cart operation, right? Well-known thing with an MBA to go out and get a donkey and cart operation. You can go to the farm and you can say, okay, I'd like to buy some of your surplus grain, and you can inspect it and so on, and they can engage in a transaction. What's the nature of information in that transaction between the local farmer who's growing the grain and somebody who shows up with a donkey and cart to sort of buy up the surplus? Is it good or bad? Is it good or bad information? Good or bad information? Good information. Why is it good information?
It's exactly at the point where they're the ones who are exchanging information, so the information is the right information.
Yeah, they have essentially all of the knowledge that they need in order to eliminate for potential problems in that transaction, right? The farmer knows how much he needs to sell the wheat for, the grain for. The person who's collecting it knows how much she is willing to pay. And so when they're both parties to that transaction, they have good information, which means that there is transactional efficiency in that information. And then as the grain moves off the farm into the cart, it carries with it that good information. And as if we imagine simply moving up our supply chain, and we'll use the case of Egypt here because it was the one that was outlined in the case, as it moves up that supply chain, so it goes from the donkey in the cart to the village thresher who buys it from the local merchant and threshes the grain, who then sells it on to a ship owner who moves it up the Nile to a local granary. And from the local granary, it then gets aggregated into a larger granary. And from there, it goes up to Alexandria. And from Alexandria, it gets stored in another granary. And from there, it goes on to a boat to Rome. And it goes to Rome to another granary in the side of Rome. And then it goes to up the Tiber River into Rome itself, where it ends up in a Roman granary, where it ends up in a Roman bakery, where finally somebody eats it as bread. If we follow that supply chain along, at every moment where there is a transaction, so when Georgiana sells it to Antonio, sells it to Amber, and so on, every time they're engaging in a transaction, what is the nature of information in that transaction? Good or bad? Good. Why? Quantity, price, quality. Do you have a moral hazard problem in that transactional relationship? Why is there not a moral hazard problem here in this relationship?
Face-to-face transaction.
It's a face-to-face transaction, and the transaction isn't constrained. If somebody comes up to the granary with a certain amount of supply to sell you, and they're asking too much or the quality isn't good, what are you going to do? Buy from somebody else. You're not constrained into the transaction, right? Because you're assuming the entire risk along that chain. As each intervener, as each intermediary is assuming the entire risk along that chain, what are they going to do as a consequence of assuming that entire risk? They're going to make sure that the good that they collect is of sufficient quality, is exactly what's ordered, so that they can sell it on and move that risk on to the next party up the chain. And that should guard then against any problems of moral hazard or adverse selection. It means that each person along the chain is making sure that the quality of the good remains intact, so that the risk that they're taking is mitigated. And if it's not, you're going to find somebody else. And moreover, because it's subject to locally competitive forces, if the farmer's asking too much for the grain, you can simply go to another farmer. If the donkey and cart operation is asking too much, you find somebody else. And so the locally competitive forces further reinforce the efficiency of the market. And so you have transactional relationships which are characterized by good information in a locally competitive environment, which suggests you have a very efficient market indeed, right? Such that by the time the grain arrives in Rome, having gone through all of those intermediaries and having good information passed along to it in an informationally efficient way, and it arrives then at the bakery in Rome, and some nice Roman citizen, hungry, looking for his free morning bread, shows up to buy the bread, what's the problem that that Roman citizen encounters as a result of this market? What's going to be the issue that he or she faces? Price.
It can be too expensive because of so many intermediaries.
Do you agree? Yeah. He's going to show up at the bakery and the price of bread is going to be literally like his first child, right? In other words, we've introduced so many transaction costs into the supply chain that by the time it arrives in Rome, no one can buy it. Which means it doesn't get to Rome in the first place. There is no market. Which is then curious for us, because is that not the best way to solve for the problem of the market? If the problem of the market is a lack of information, isn't the best way to solve then for that problem of information simply to introduce a transactional environment where information is passed efficiently along from person to person to person? Isn't that the way you would give the market the information that it needs? Is there a better way? Absent, say, going back in time and giving the Romans internet and telephone. So assuming that we can't engage in time travel, is there another way that we can give the market good information so that by the time the commodity arrives at its final destination, the information that it needs is priced into the good? And the answer is no. An entrepreneurial-driven market of the kind that we've seen, individual intermediaries undertaking their own risk and then moving the commodity along the supply chain, means they're moving the information along with them in the supply chain, and that leads to very good information at the end. But if you then have unbearably high transaction costs, it puts a natural limit to the market, doesn't it? The market can only extend out as far as those transaction costs allow, which in this case might be, who knows, somewhere on the upper Nile. Beyond that, it's simply too expensive and there's no market. So as we've seen, when we solve for the problem of information in the market, we do so at the expense of unacceptably high transaction costs, meaning that the market cannot function since the cost of using the market to move grain to Rome is simply too high. So we're back where we began. The paradox of the market is it doesn't have enough information. We've given the market now the information that it needs, but we've done so at the expense of unacceptably high costs, which means we're no closer to solving the central dilemma: how did the Romans manage to get this market working?